Welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know, you are in the most recent expanded virtual brown bag session. My name is Alex Wiseman. I have the honor of representing both of the sponsors of today's expanded virtual brown bag session, which is the Texas Tech University Educational Leadership Policy Program and the Center for Innovative Research and Change, Leadership and Education. And I'm really delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you as we gather for today's expanded session featuring I think I can use that now, right? Dr. Jennifer Freeman from the University of Pennsylvania. In just a few minutes, she'll be presenting her work titled More Than an Email, The Effects of Transfer Student-Faculty Interactions at a Four-Year University. But let me say just a couple of things about expanded before we go on. Many of you have been to one of our virtual brown bags before, but for those of you who are new to us, this is part of a series of virtual brown bag sessions, which we think really are important for developing an environment of innovation and research and learning and collaboration that extends among our local community as well as across the state and across the nation, and even internationally. We've had lots of international visitors in the past. So please check out and share our website with your colleagues, friends, and students. If you Google TTU Expanded, our website should be one of the first items in the results list. And please feel free to register for as many of our upcoming brown bags as you can. We want to see you there. I will give a short plug. We are going to have a graduate student talk next week on April 30th. That will begin at 6 p.m. Central. That information will be on our website shortly. That'll be the last one for this academic year, but we'll be starting back up again in the fall. I'm really proud of the different ensemble of researchers, educators, and experts that Expanded has had over this past year as well as preceding years. Just so you know, all of the talks are recorded. You can access any of our previous talks by going to that same website. You'll see this year's talks on that front page, but there's also a link to archived talks from past years as well. So please check them all out. I wanted to also point out that Expanded isn't just about the speaker or the expert delivering information. It's also about engagement. So as it's appropriate, we invite all of you to participate actively, ask questions, challenge assumptions, collaborate with us in the pursuit of knowledge, because your perspectives and your experiences and your ideas are valuable and they enrich our collective understanding. So if you have questions or comments that come up while Dr. Freeman is speaking, please feel free to type those into the chat so that they're saved and they're there, and she can get to them as soon as she's through her presentation. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment during the Q&A time that follows her talk, well, all you got to do is unmute and ask your question, and we'll have a great exchange of ideas and information. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer Freeman. She received her Ph.D. in Education Policy from the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education this spring, and will be joining the College of Education at Texas Tech University as an assistant professor this fall. So for those of you who are Texas Tech affiliated, you will get to see Dr. Freeman more in the fall. Her research focuses on two broad areas of education. First, she delves into the nexus between high schools, higher education, and the workforce, exploring the non-traditional pathways students take as they navigate these sectors. Her work particularly focuses on students in high school career and technical education, or CTE, community college attendees, and those transferring to four-year institutions. Second, Jennifer's work interrogates how inclusive educational policies and practices can promote more equitable outcomes for students with disabilities across the educational pipeline. As a graduate student, Jennifer secured the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship for her work evaluating the impact of course-based undergraduate research experiences on the educational and labor market outcomes of transfer students in STEM disciplines. She also received the Post-Secondary CTE Fellowship through the ECMC Foundation for her work exploring the role of STEM-focused career and technical education course taking in supporting the post-secondary and career trajectories of students with learning disabilities. Jennifer's research is motivated by her experiences as a community college transfer student in a STEM field and her work as an educator for students with disabilities. She holds an MA in Statistics and Data Science from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and an MA in education and a BS in zoology from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Jen, welcome. We're so glad you're here, and the floor is yours. What can I help with? There you go. You're
Oh,
unmuted.
sorry. My headphones started picking up and then letting down the sound, so I missed the introduction, but I'm sure it was great. I appreciate it. Thank you. Well, hi everyone. Thank you for being here today. And my name is Jen. Like Alex said, I'm really excited to be joining Texas Tech in the fall. But today I'm here to talk with you all about some ongoing research that has been um, a few years in the making. And it is entitled More Than Email, The Effects of Transfer Student Faculty Interactions at a Four-Year University. So this research actually started when I myself was a transfer student at a four-year institution. I received a research award there to conduct a survey of transfer students to understand more about the transfer student experience, and then was able to use that as a pilot to run a larger survey, which I'm going to be sharing with you all today. But it's really motivated by my own personal experiences, which a lot of my research is motivated by my own personal experiences in the education sector, but I'm really excited to share this with you all today. So before I start talking about transfer students, we need to take a few steps back and think about community colleges. So community colleges have really been in the center of national dialogue recently. This is mainly because of discussions of expanding free community colleges for students across the entire United States, and certain states offering, subsidizing the cost of attending community colleges or offering different scholarship or grant programs to, bolster the current resources for community colleges. And this is really important because we know that community colleges are an essential component in undergraduate education and workforce development in the United States. So to talk a little bit more about the role of community colleges, this is data from the 2021-22 school year from the Community College Research Center. But it showed that in this school year, about 22 million undergrads were enrolled in post-secondary education across the United States, and 41%, or roughly 9 million students, were enrolled in the two-year sector. And this is not super surprising. We know that community colleges have been widely recognized for their low cost and open access admissions. These institutions are really important because they enroll a disproportionate share of low income first generation students, racially minoritized students, adult students, and students with disabilities. And the opportunities in terms of pathways for students are equally as diverse at community colleges. Student goals include either earning a diploma, a short-term credential, acquiring job-specific training, or taking adult education courses. But as you could have guessed by the title of my presentation, one of the most critical functions of the community college system is the vertical transfer pathway. And there are a few different definitions of transfer, but for this specific project, I'm referring to vertical transfer, which means transferring from a community college or public two-year institution to a four-year institution. So just a few more national statistics tracking transfer in the United States. So this data also comes from the Community College Research Center, but it looks at a cohort of students who began at community colleges in the 2015-2016 school year. And of those students, about 80% expressed interest in earning a bachelor's degree via this transfer pathway. However, only about 32% successfully transferred within 6 years. And then if we think about this outcome of earning a bachelor's degree, only about 16% earned a bachelor's degree within 6 years. And these rates are even lower for minority students and for low income students. So what is happening here? Well, there are obviously some issues along this entire pathway. However, for this specific project, I'm focusing in on what happens after a student transfers to a four-year institution, this second part of the graph. What's happening that's influencing their ability or their unsuccessful attempts of earning a bachelor's degree. And there has been a really extensive body of research dedicated to understanding, certain unique barriers and challenges that transfer students face once they are acclimating to their receiving institution that can influence not only their academic success, but ultimately their decision to either drop out or take a little bit longer to earn their degree than expected. And these can be kind of put into 5 distinct buckets. And so first and foremost, when you're starting in a new school, it's exactly what it is. It's a new environment. And adjusting to a new educational environment can sometimes be a difficult experience. Even something as simple as, I don't know where my classes are. I don't know where student health is if I need to have a doctor's appointment, or I don't know where a tutoring center is. And it could also have to do with adjusting to some unfamiliar norms and expectations that may have been different at your community colleges. So, students may have become accustomed to a learning environment with smaller classrooms where they may know more students in their classes and know their faculty members. And when you're adjusting to a new institution, you may be sitting in a 400-person lecture hall and may not be accustomed to these types of learning experiences. Second, has to do with the social aspects of transferring. So, when you're adjusting to new institution, you're adjusting to an entirely new body of students. And especially when the students that you're surrounded in didn't come from community colleges, they're going to be a little bit different from you. We know that transfer students tend to be older, tend to have difficulties in forming relationships with the students at their receiving institution, and can perceive peers as being, unfriendly or overly competitive. And we also know that, transfer students tend to be less involved in extracurricular activities, less likely to join like social clubs and so forth. And this all together can really contribute to weak social and academic support networks, and ultimately result in students feeling isolated or having a poor sense of belonging to the receiving institution. Next has to do with the academic challenges. Transfer students are often perceived as lacking academic preparation. And while there is research to show that that isn't necessarily the case, and that's a very somewhat deficit view to take of these students, we do know from research of this phenomenon of transfer shock. When students are first adjusting to the receiving institution, they can experience a drop in their GPA. And this can due to just adjusting to the new academic rigor of an institution, or having to adjust to a more restricted pathway they have to take in terms of coursework. Fourth has to do with institutional barriers and also just educational practices at a receiving institution. So, transfer students tend to lose on average a good amount of credits when they're transferring, because there aren't these really well thought out articulation agreements. And when you lose credits, it means that you're going to potentially have to retake some courses, which costs time and money for students. And also in terms of educational practices, some teaching practices can inadvertently marginalize transfer students, with faculty members not even realizing it's happening. So an example from my own experience as a transfer student is I was in this genetics course, my first quarter, and the last question on a midterm was with 20% of the grade, and it was something I had never seen before. And I freaked out, and I was like, we never learned this. What is this question? And when we were going over the midterm the following week, the faculty member said, "You all took intro bio with me last year. That was a test. You should have all remembered that question." But the issue was I didn't take intro bio at this institution. I didn't have him as a faculty member. So that induced another hurdle of me having to go to office hours and be like, can I have opportunities for extra credit? This is 20% of my midterm. And then lastly, just has to do with balancing external responsibilities. A lot of transfer students face unique financial and time-related constraints because they tend to be more likely to work full or part-time to finance their education, or more likely to have dependents or familial responsibilities. And taken together, all of these kind of buckets of challenges work to contribute to this phenomenon called the transfer penalty, which is the reduced probability of completing a degree for students who started a community college. And we also know from research that when compared to students who began college at the four-year institution, transfer students are more likely to drop out and more likely to switch majors as well. And so this all, it's hard to talk about. It's some unfair experiences, some institutional barriers that are impeding the success of these students. So I want to switch gears and talk about what can we do to support transfer students? What are some interventions, some practices that institutions can implement that can kind of ease some of these barriers that they face and ultimately support their persistence? So on the academic front, enhanced academic advising, learning communities, summer bridge programs, these types of practices that facilitate learning and kind of create academic communities amongst students can contribute to higher GPAs and persistence. Next, in terms of social support systems, peer mentoring programs, transfer-specific social events, these types of interventions that can help integrate students into the campus community can promote both some of these environmental transferring issues I talked about previously, but also help students become more familiar with their institution. And then lastly, institutional support. So institutions can, provide more dedicated orientation programs, especially financial aid and scholarship opportunities. All of these types of experiences, interventions can kind of work together to kind of work against some of these obstacles I was talking about in the previous couple slides. But if you could have guessed by the name of this presentation, I'm here to talk with you about faculty interactions. And numerous studies have listed faculty interactions, forming relationships with faculty members amongst the most influential factors that shape transfer students' experiences. And the reason is because this is not just confined to classrooms and to academic outcomes. Forming relationships with faculty members cuts across all three aspects of these different supports: academic, social, and institutional support, and can profoundly influence the experiences of transfer students once they transfer. So a little background about faculty interactions, specifically the theory behind student-faculty interactions. So some of the biggest names in theoretical models we think about in terms of higher education all tend to mention the importance of these types of bonds between students and their professors. So first, Aston's involvement theory suggests that student involvement in meaningful educational activities is really essential for their learning and development, and frequent interactions with faculty members are amongst one of the most beneficial forms of involvement for these students. Next, when we're thinking about Tinto's theory of student departure, this model really highlights the importance of student-faculty interactions in terms of influencing students' decisions to stay in college. And lastly, Weidmann's college socialization theory. Student-faculty interactions are a significant factor in the socialization process, and also to help students socialize into a specific discipline or into a specific career path. So taken together, kind of based off of these different types of theories, there's been a host of studies that have shown positive effects of various forms of student-faculty interaction on numerous outcomes, including academic outcomes like GPA, graduation rates, retention, satisfaction, and also some psychosocial benefits like educational aspirations, self-concept, motivation, and also career attitudes and career choice. But it is important to mention that the benefits of these kind of interactions depend on a few different factors. It depends on the quality, frequency, and nature of interactions. And there's a lot of different types of interactions you can have with a faculty member. It's not a homogenous, treatment. You can have in-class interactions like raising your hand and answering questions during lecture. Those types of interactions can foster active learning and engagement in class. You also have out of class interactions like attending office hours. Going to a professor's office hours, as we all know in this group, can really provide personal guidance and form kind of these better bonds between students and their faculty members. And even, informal interactions, like casual encounters on campus, saying hi, waving, making that connection can make it easier for students to have a sense of belonging on campus. However, you also have to think of the other side of these interactions. And there are instances where students report negative interactions with faculty members, which can have deleterious effects on their performance and persistence. And the second thing to understand about interactions is that they're conditional. And by conditional, I mean they really vary based on student demographics. And that really kind of laid the foundation for this research project. And so that brings us into transfer student-faculty interactions. What do we know? The answer is we don't know much, which is why I wanted to do this study. But what we do know is that transfer students often report facing a lot of difficulties in building relationships with faculty member. And there's numerous reasons for this. I mean, time is a big aspect. Transfer students typically have less time on campus to form these relationships with faculty members. But there's also some research that shows that there are some pretty pronounced barriers to meaningful interactions between transfer students and their faculty members. Faculties, like I already mentioned on the previous page, some faculty members can have, negative perceptions of transfer students, which can inherently contribute to challenges in teaching and also hinder their relationship forming, kind of like that experience I gave with my professor, having perceptions of what I should have known, but I was a transfer student, I didn't. And I mean, there's even some really interesting qualitative pieces that interview faculty members, and they refer to transfer students' lives as messy and complex, and it's difficult for them to form meaningful relationships with them. So that brings us to kind of what we don't know. Like I said, the vast majority of studies that are actually looking at the effects of different types of interactions focus primarily on students who started at a four-year institution. And it's unclear how different types of communication and different types of interaction actually affect transfer students, both academically and on different outcomes. And so that brings us to this current study, which really explores the influence of faculty communication on GPA and graduation outcomes, as well as students' overall satisfaction with the university experience. And the main guiding question for this portion of this study that I'm going to be sharing with you all is, does the frequency of interactions between transfer students and faculty relate to academic and psychosocial outcomes? So like I mentioned earlier, the data for this come from a survey that I conducted at a single institution within the University of California system. And to give you a little bit of an idea of this campus profile, the UC system is the largest post-secondary system in the world. This specific campus has about 22,000 undergraduate students, and transfer students make up about 24% of the student body. It is important to note that these characteristics are from when I collected the data, which was in 2018/2019. However, these mainly still hold true. Over 29% of the campus identifies as either Chicano or Latino, and so it is designated as a Hispanic serving institution. And it is also important to note, which is one of the important implications of this research, is that the UC system has been really increasingly admitting transfer students with this ultimate goal of having at least 30% of the bachelor's degrees being awarded on campus to transfer students, and they have met that goal in recent years. On to the data for this project. Like I said, this was a transfer student survey I conducted, and just some basic information. It was an electronic survey, took students about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. Students were entered into a lottery to win $10 Amazon gift cards. And we got about 524 responses where students actually finished the survey from start to finish and entered in their email. And for missing data for this specific study, as long as I wasn't missing more than about 5% of the data on certain measures, I used multiple imputation to account for the missingness. Next, onto the meat of it. What did I ask in this survey? So there was a lot of different content areas I focused on. First, I wanted to get background characteristics on the students. And then I asked a series of different questions, all on Likert scales related to their community college experiences, their perceptions of the transfer process, their perceptions of integration and satisfaction with their university experience, and also their academic outcomes. And based off of these different subsets and chunks of the survey, I used exploratory factor analysis to compile different scales related to certain subsets of questions. And I should mention that this survey really drew on previously used surveys of the entire UC campus as a whole, and also some surveys conducted by Kim and Sachs in the field of faculty interactions, and also Frankie Lennon, who did a lot of research about the transfer student experience. So for my faculty interaction scales, this is what this entire project really leans on. The survey contained 12 individual questions that asked students about the frequency with which they interact with faculty members. And EFA suggested that 3 scales should be used. And after kind of digging into what these different survey constructs was, I came up with these kind of identifiers for them. So first had to do with course-specific interactions. This asked students about whether they attended office hours, whether they exchanged emails with the professor for clarification on a topic, whether they sought help from faculty members when needed, and also had a class where a professor learned their name. Next is post-course interactions. So this is whether students developed a personal or working relationship with the professor following enrollment, whether they had a strong enough relationship with the professor to ask for a letter of recommendation, and whether they ever assisted a previous faculty member in conducting research. And then lastly has to do with adverse or negative interactions. These were questions related to whether a student had been put at a disadvantage during coursework or outside of coursework for being a transfer student, whether they felt stigmatized by faculty for being a transfer student, and also whether they were expected to be familiar with topics taught in courses that I did not take at this university. And I threw that one in there just because of my own experience, but I was happy to see that this was backed up by research upon further investigation down the road. In terms of the other measures that I used for this analysis, I had 4 outcomes. First was self-reported GPA, overall GPA. Next was intentions to graduate on time. So this asked students whether they expected to graduate within 2 years of their initial enrollment at the campus. Next was satisfaction with the UC experience. And this was a scale of 4 measures that had been previously used by Kim and Sachs and some other studies in this field, basically related to whether or not students were satisfied with their experience. An example of this is, knowing what I know now, I would still choose to enroll at this institution. And then lastly is a scale related to post-graduation readiness. And this had to do with preparation, guidance, and confidence in their future success. So kind of looking forward beyond graduation. And an example of this is, I feel my university has prepared me for future endeavors. There was questions about career preparation in graduate school as well. So the student characteristics. We had a host of student characteristics that I asked about, gender identity, race and ethnicity, whether the students identified as being a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, disability status, first generation status. Also had some measures related to their family, income, highest level of parental education, and then some college experiences that we know are important to think about specifically when looking at transfer students. So, any external time commitments, the time spent that they spend on academics and socializing to get a better idea of how integrated these students are into the campus community. In terms of the characteristics of the sample, here's a little breakdown. we see that roughly 25% of the sample was Latinx, 22% Asian, 42% of the students were white, and at the time of the data collection, this is really on par for this campus as a whole. And then next, some characteristics. Almost half of the sample was reported they were first generation college student. About 13% identified as being a member of the LGBTQIA community. About 12% reported having a disability, and about 40% reported that they were employed. So in terms of the analysis plan, remember I have my 4 outcomes, I have my 3 scales of faculty-student interactions. The first plan would be to just use a basic OLS regression with my 3 scales of faculty interactions in there to see if these are related to any of my 4 outcomes. However, the issue here is that OLS does not take into account any confounding factors among variables included in the model. And so this would be a cause for concern, let's say, if transfer students report communicating with faculty differently based off of some of their own characteristics. You know, first generation students may interact with faculty different than students who aren't first generation. There could be differences by race or ethnicity or by other control measures included in my model. So to take this to kind of try and address this, I'm also using propensity score matching in this analysis. So propensity score matching yields a average treatment effect for the treated, or an ATT, which is hopefully a more accurate estimate of the effect of interactions with faculty on our outcome measures. And this occurs in 2 steps. So first, you use a logistic regression to basically predict what is the probability of a student receiving treatment or reporting one of these types of interactions with faculty members. You get a propensity score for each individual ranging from 0 to 1, and then you use this propensity score to try and match individuals with similar propensity scores to try, except the only difference is one received this treatment, the other didn't, and you're trying to improve the accuracy on the variable of interest by removing some of this confounding variation. However, in order to use propensity score matching in this example, I had to make a few changes to my analysis plan. So first, my scales of faculty interaction, these are continuous scales, and I needed to convert these into binary measures to try and match students based off of whether or not they had high reported levels of these types of interactions with faculty. So I tried a few different methods of doing this. I tried using a threshold approach where above, let's say, a 4 on a generalized scale equals high interaction, because these are Likert scales. I also used standardization, the standard deviation approach, and I ended up proceeding with the median split, which basically, if your scale was above the median on a certain scale, you were assigned a value of 1, and not you were assigned a value of 0 to try and get at this binary treatment effect for reporting high or low levels of interactions with faculty. Then step 2, I reran that OLS model that I showed you on the previous screen. However, I ran each measure independently. So 3 different regressions, each for each specific type of faculty interaction. And then I proceeded with propensity score matching and used kernel matching, which is useful for trying to maintain the power statistically, because it does include all of your treatment cases and doesn't throw away too many treatment cases at all. So moving into the findings, this is the baseline OLS findings. So if you recall, this is one regression that has all 3 scales of interaction included, and we see the 4 outcomes across the top. So to begin, we're seeing that none of the scales of faculty interaction are related to students reporting that they're on track to graduate. However, when we look at the other outcomes, we are seeing some significant results. And please note that all of my continuous outcomes have been standardized, so they can be interpreted as effect sizes because they're standardized betas. But in terms of course-specific interactions, we're seeing that higher reported measures of course-specific interactions, and these, included attending office hours, reaching out to a faculty member when you needed help, etc. These students reported an overall higher level of satisfaction with the university experience and reported higher values of this post-graduation readiness. In terms of post-course graduation, we're seeing that students who report higher values of post-course interactions, so these are, forming strong relationships with faculty after enrolling in their course, participating in undergraduate research, etc. These students are reporting higher GPAs and also higher values of satisfaction with the university experience and post-grad readiness. And we're seeing the same kind of patterns of significance for the adverse interactions, except for they're all negative. So students who are having these kind of negative interactions with faculty members are reporting lower GPAs, lower satisfaction with the university experience, and reporting being less ready for life post-graduation. But like I said, that is the model where we looked at all of the three scales together. So I want to take you to the next slide, which is after turning those scales into binary indicators and then running propensity score matching on the what did we find? So first, looking at this OLS, the good news is when the standardized scales are run in separate regressions, we're seeing the same pattern of significance. So nothing is changing too much here with respect to the estimates from the previous page compared to these findings. But when we get into the propensity score matching analysis, we're seeing that once again, there's no relationship between any of our forms of faculty interactions and our four measures of outcomes. In our measure of being on track to graduate. Next, we're seeing in terms of course-specific interactions, a similar pattern, namely that students who have higher values of course-specific interactions are more likely to be satisfied with the university experience and more likely to be ready for post-graduation life. So for example, a coefficient of 0.39 in terms of satisfaction, that would indicate that a student who reported having high levels of course-related interaction with faculty member, which is coded as a 1 here, will have an average satisfaction score that is 0.39 standard deviations higher on average, which is a pretty, it's a medium size effect in terms of social science research. Next, post-course interactions, similar findings with regards to GPA satisfaction and post-graduation readiness. And then once again, we're seeing these negative effects of these adverse interactions with faculty members. Transfer students who are having these adverse interactions are more likely to have lower GPAs, report less satisfaction with the university experience, and report being less ready for life post-graduation. So in terms of discussion, implications for this, take a sip of water. In terms of institutional policies, this has to do with my findings related to the post-course interactions. And we know that post-course interactions are crucial for student satisfaction and readiness for the future. But it's important to look back to what research tells us. So research tells us that certain post-course interactions, like having a strong enough relationship with a faculty member to ask for a letter of recommendation, or participating in undergraduate research experiences. These are really predictive of academic performance, satisfaction, and readiness for the future. And these types of interactions beyond coursework really connect students with their discipline, with their professor, with opportunities for the future. And my findings are showing that that tends to be true. These students are reporting higher GPAs, more satisfaction with the university experience, and being more ready for life post-graduation. But we know that transfer students often face barriers in accessing these types of experiences. For example, transfer students tend to be far less likely to participate in undergraduate research experiences. And these types of experiences, it's not necessarily that they don't want to participate, it's just that there's certain institutional barriers like time and prerequisites that maybe don't afford them the opportunity to do so. So coming up with different policies to make sure that these students can access these opportunities is crucial. Next, the next implication has to do with faculty development and professional development opportunities. And this has to do with my other two findings. So I found that course-related interactions were related to satisfaction and post-graduation readiness. But I also found that these negative interactions were harmful for students. And the research I talked about at the beginning of this presentation about how faculty can have certain perceptions of transfer students' academic performance or their abilities, we need to help faculty members understand the unique challenges faced by transfer students, including overcoming negative perceptions that may impede the effectiveness of their interactions. And I think that kind of raising awareness about the transfer student experience is more important than ever, especially given that the number of transfer students on university campuses across the country is just going to continue to grow and grow over the coming years. And helping create more supportive and inclusive learning environments and taking these kind of proactive measures to make sure that faculty members both are aware of their experiences to support these in-class interactions and to try and mitigate these negative interactions is definitely an important step to take. And then lastly, has to do with future research. Like I mentioned, the vast majority of this research has been focused on students who begin their educational experience, post-secondary educational experience at a four-year university, and more research needs to be done. And this is just one small survey of a small subset of transfer students at one campus, but if we're seeing that there is such high frequencies of students having negative interactions with faculty members, more research needs to be done. The limitations, like I said, in terms of generalizability, this is a single campus in one university system, so that does influence the generalizability. Also, I had to rely on students' self-report of their GPA and being on track to graduate, which may introduce biases. And then lastly, propensity score matching, while I'm trying to get at some of the issues here with selection bias, it's never going to be perfect. There's still going to be unmeasured variables that could influence my results. But even with these limitations, I kind of see this as a first step in hopefully starting a whole new line of research to really try and get at what can we do to better support transfer students, because there's such a large population on campuses across the United States. And the next steps, like I said, this is very much a project that is in progress, and I'm really interested in running some subgroup analysis to try and get at maybe these conditional effects for different students based off of race, gender, first generation status. I'm also interested in looking at whether there are any discipline specific trends in faculty student interactions. So stay tuned for that. But I'm really excited to hear any questions, comments, suggestions you have to kind of push this research into its next stage. Thank you.
Yay, thank you so much, Jen. That was really, really interesting. We have time for plenty of comments or questions. Jacob has already put a comment in the chat. Jen, if you want to check there and see if that needs a response.
Absolutely. So that was a bullet point that I had in one of my versions. I really think that that may be something that's happening with I'll read it out loud. Jacob said, I wonder if the null findings for on track is due to reporting bias in the survey. I think that could definitely be a factor here. The question asked if students were on track to graduate within 2 years. Students may have taken that as 2 years as of now or 2 years as of initial enrollment. And he says, or do students even know if they're on track? Yeah, the phrasing on track could be something going on here. I would love if I could somehow link this to institutional data, but we know that will be difficult to do.
All right, folks, if you've got questions, now's the time. I have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll ask one while folks are thinking. I really find this interesting. I wanted to maybe clarify some things just for me. You probably said it and I missed it. So when you say transfer student, you're specifically talking about community college transfer students, not from another four-year institution.
Correct.
And so all of that background information that you provided is specific to community college transfer students?
Correct. That is
Okay.
correct. Yeah.
So I wondered if in you mentioned quality, frequency, and nature of interaction as sort of being the big three in terms of determining how much it affected those outcomes. Do any of those, well, in particular, does frequency sort of level off at some point or start to be negative? Like if you're meeting every day, or, can you go overboard on that? And was there literature on that, like when there was too much of a good thing?
I am not aware of any research that I've read that looks at that. However, I'm sure that there's always going to be a tipping point. And also it's important to think about too, does the frequency of certain types of interaction kind of tell you a bit about the student? Are you really struggling academically and that's why you're reaching out to your professor a lot? Or is it just for clarification? There are a lot of questions there that I unfortunately couldn't get at in the survey, but those questions are really important to think about because I feel like oftentimes in research, we kind of try and homogenize a experience or a treatment variable into one clean cut category. And I think that's really why the majority of research in this field has been on a qualitative front and not necessarily quantitative, but really good questions to think about.
Yeah. I have one more question, then I'll shut up and see if people have any. Oh, someone just posted one. So let me ask this quickly. I'm wondering, I think one of the things that you asked was when did they transfer? How long has it been since they transferred? And I wondered if the effects of transfer or the effects of faculty interaction changed the longer a student had been at the four-year institution. Like were the effects greater when they were brand new? Did they stay that way the whole way through? Maybe you said that and I missed
That's
it.
it. No, that's a great question. And I think that's what James Kipper just put in the chat. That would be a really interesting subgroup analysis to do because I do have year since transfer. I also have total credit accumulation since transfer. And I mean, these are all obviously self-reported measures, but those would be a couple interesting ways to kind of get at whether it's seniority on campus. Like I've been a transfer student for a year and a half. I've already been here. I know that I need to go and talk to my faculty members versus I'm new on campus. So those are really great ideas for some subgroup analysis.
I said it'd be quiet, so I'll try. So, anybody have other questions? You can put it in the chat. You can unmute and ask.
I think there's a good question in the chat.
have the number of credit hours for classification. Yeah, I do have the number of credits I asked a few credit questions just to try and I was interested in also credit loss as well. So I do have the total number of credits they transferred with. California does have more specific rules about specifically the UC system articulation agreements. You have to have at least 60 units completed prior to matriculation in as a transfer student. So we know all of them are at least supposed to be at junior standing, but I do also have information about whether or not they lost credits. And so you can kind of work backward from there to potentially infer how many credits they're going to need to reach that 120 credit or quarter credit rate they need in order to graduate.
Other questions? I'm not very good at silence, Jen, so I'll ask another question while I'm just thinking. And this goes back to, it isn't directly related to the analysis that you did, but more to the context that you gave us leading up to this. I'm wondering if, since you have been you've sort of lived it, you've studied it, you've reviewed the literature on it, where does the responsibility lie institutionally for helping transfer students and faculty interaction sort of take place? Is that something that community colleges should be working more explicitly with students on to help them make that transition, or is it on the other end? Does anybody talk about that?
So I think there's a couple of things at play. One is I think community colleges have a lot on their plate already. And I don't know, I think it should definitely be a shared responsibility, but there's this great body of research that has been really growing in the last couple of years about the complicity of four-year institutions and this kind of transfer penalty, and especially regarded to like resource allocation. Resources disproportionately go towards support programs, orientations for first-year students that are not transfer students because they're bringing in more money for the institution. They're going to be there for longer. There are some really great ways to kind of help transfer students. I mean, I met Jacob when I was a transfer student in this transfer student university course. So it was a first quarter course that transfer students could enroll in, introduces students to a bunch of different support services on campus, teaches you about the importance of forming relationships with faculty members, and courses like that can kind of fulfill a general writing requirement are really great. Not all institutions are doing that. And I also think it's important to think about the context of this study. The UC system has one of the most the easiest, as you could say, transfer process from a CC to a four-year institution. The transfer process in California between the Cal States and the UCs is one of the smoothest ones in the country. And so most of my experience and research has been within those systems. And so I can't really speak to what's going on in other places, but there definitely are ways that we can support transfer students once they transfer that don't really put the onus on the community colleges.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Jen, I have a question. So thinking about your recommendations in particularly the Texas context where community colleges, I think kind of unlike California, are very under-resourced. They're constantly chasing funding. With a framework of like benefit cost, right? Thinking about like biggest bang for your buck, of your recommendations, like what do you think is the lowest hanging fruit, or what do you think is most convincing to actually drive policy change for community colleges, either at their level or at the state level?
That's a great question. In terms of low hanging fruit, I mean, you could, all different research studies, I feel like one of the most common recommendations is professional development. And professional development isn't always going to be that helpful. It's going to vary across availability of faculty members for these experiences. So I think it's more about preparing students as they're entering, letting them know the benefits of interacting with faculty members, even if it's just a more extended orientation process. Not even creating these special courses that cost money and you need teaching assistants and faculty members to teach. But orientation is something that comes up time and time again in the transfer student literature. From my own personal experience, you know, the first year students had a week-long orientation where they got to stay on campus for a week and meet with academic advisors. And then the transfer students, we had a 3-hour one random Saturday a couple weeks before school started and felt overwhelmed with all the information we were getting and didn't feel like we knew a lot going into the first day. So I think just investing a little bit more on the front end on orientation processes and letting students know kind of what they're getting themselves into and the potential benefits of forming relationships with faculty member, I think that could be some of the low-hanging fruit.
Jen, this has been fascinating. An hour goes quickly, doesn't it? We're at the end of our time. If you had a question or wanted to ask about other things, Jen did put her email address up there. I don't know if you want to share that again, just in case, or you can ask me and I'll give you her email address. Jen, we're super excited to have you joining us here at Texas Tech in the fall. Yes, it's going to be great. And thanks again for coming. Thank you everyone for being here, and look for this recording posted on our ExpandED website shortly. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.